After my parents refused to help babysit and compared my children to my sister's kids, I stopped helping them with free house repairs. The following day, my phone burst. Thanksgiving was intended to be a time for family, excellent food, and a reprieve from reality, but it turned out to be a disaster. We were all gathered at my parents' new property, which I had spent the previous 2 months renovating for them. They had asked me to do it, so I accepted. New floors, plumbing repairs, repainting, and electrical work. I spent every free hour there, covered in dust and sweat, ensuring that everything was flawless. Meanwhile, they sat peacefully in their flat, waiting for the house to be completed. I did not complain. They were my parents, and helping them was the right thing to do. In exchange, I had requested only one thing: occasional babysitting. Not every day, not every weekend, only when I needed it. My wife died a few years ago, and I was doing my best to raise my children alone. But sometimes I needed assistance. I believed it made sense, and they had always agreed, until that night. We were in the middle of supper when my father laid down his fork and said, "We're not going to babysit your kids anymore." I assumed he was kidding, but his expression was serious. The table became quiet. Then he went on to imply that they were exhausted, that my children were too much, and, worst of all, compared them to my sister's children. He mentioned how well-behaved, quiet, and easy they were, unlike mine. I looked over to my sister. She didn't say anything, just sat there smiling. Something inside of me twisted. I'd spent 2 months fixing up her house for free. They had never had to lift a finger, and now they were telling me that my children, were a burden to them, that they weren't as good as my sisters. I took a big breath and tried to hold it together. Then I said, "Really? I'll stop fixing your house." There was silence. My father just looked at me like I had hit him. My mother stepped in and tried to smooth things over. She started talking about how I didn't realize how difficult it was for them, and how much they had done for me. She made it appear as if I was pushing them to do unpaid work, while in reality, I had barely asked for anything. Before I could react, several of our other relatives spoke up. They did not like it. One of my aunts remarked it was foolish to talk about my children in that manner, especially in front of them. Another uncle pointed out how much I had already done for my parents, thereby saving them thousands of dollars on repairs. My sister remained mute, soaking all the accolades for her wonderful children. I stood up. "Thank you for a great Thanksgiving dinner," I told you. "I'm extremely grateful for everything." I then turned to my children and informed them that we were going. We collected our coats and hurried to the car, leaving a table filled with startled expressions. That night, my children questioned me why their grandparents had said those things, and why they were constantly comparing them to their cousins. I moaned and stroked my cheek. The world isn't always fair, and sometimes grandparents aren't the nicest people. They gazed at me, expecting for more, so I made sure to express what was most important. "But I love you both more than anything." I went to bed, weary. I had no regrets, but it hurt nonetheless. The next morning, I had 52 missed calls from my parents. When I saw 52 missed calls, I assumed something horrible had happened. My stomach dropped. I instantly called my mother back, half expecting to hear about an emergency. Instead, as soon as she answered the phone, she began ranting as if I had personally set fire to her home. "John, you need to come over right now," she urged. I frowned. "Why? What happened?" She skirted the question and insisted that I come over. My father also got on the phone, his tone tense but controlled. "Just come, John. We need to talk." I was not foolish. I knew exactly what this was about, but I knew I had to leave nonetheless. My children still had some belongings in their house, and I did not want to leave them behind. So I informed them that I'd be there in an hour. When I got inside their flat, I knew things hadn't calmed down overnight. My mother was pacing. My father was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed, and my sister, who had seemingly decided to become even more involved, was seated on the couch, as if she were moderating a presidential discussion. It began immediately as I closed the door behind me. My mother leaped in first. "John, don't you think you overreacted?" I stared at her. "Overreacted?" My father jumped in. "Look, we're sorry if we hurt your feelings, but you can't just refuse to finish the house because of this." I nearly laughed. There it was. That was what this was all about, not the family or the children, but the house. I shake my head. "So, let me get this straight. You call my kids a burden, say they're too much for you, compare them to my sister's kids in front of everyone, and now when I say I won't do the work you asked me to do for free, I'm the problem." My mother placed her palm on her chest, as if I had just badly offended her. "That's not fair, John. We have done a lot for you. We took care of your kids for years. My sister has finally spoken up. Mom, Dad, you really shouldn't compare the kids like that. For the first time, my parents seemed astonished. My mother blinked at her. You don't think we were right? My sister shrugged. It's not about being right. You just shouldn't have said it in front of the kids. It's not okay. I must admit, I didn't expect her to say that. She wasn't exactly defending me, but she wasn't supporting them either. Instead of backing down, my father turned back to me. John, we just want this to be over. You're not going to cut us off over something so small. I looked him dead in the eyes. Watch me. My mother gasped, as if I had threatened to place her in a nursing home. My father began to say something else, but I was done. I went to the closet, got my children's clothes, and proceeded out the door. And that was when my mother said it. John, you're being selfish. I paused. Selfish? After 2 months of free labor? After bending over backwards to help them? After never complaining about all the times they needed something from me? I turned around. Selfish? You want me to work on your house, but you won't even look after your own grandchildren. You want my time, my effort, my energy, but the second I need something, it's suddenly too much for you. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I was finished. You don't have to babysit anymore, but I don't have to fix your house either. Then I walked out. That was only the beginning. Things worsened during the next few weeks. First, they attempted to force me to return. Then they attempted to guilt me. Then they begged, because they had a serious situation. Hiring professionals would cost a fortune, and the longer I ignored them, the more desperate they became. But, just when I thought they couldn't get any more manipulative, something happened that changed everything. For the first few days following the incident, I ignored their calls. I ignored their text messages as well, then began the guilt trip. First, my mother gave the typical, "We're getting old, John, we won't be around forever" spiel. Then my father wrote me a long note about family loyalty and how I was being unreasonable over a minor misunderstanding. Meanwhile, my sister remained relatively silent. I assumed she was trying to stay out of it, but at least she spoke up briefly during the debate. Then, about a week after Thanksgiving, I received a message from my father that made me laugh. John, we forgive you? Can you come finish the house this weekend? Forgive me? I did not even respond. That's when they changed their strategy. At first, they tried to bribe me. My mother called to say they'd start babysitting again if I finished the house. I told her no. My father then texted me that they'd be willing to help with the kids if I came over to talk things out. I told him no. Then they sent my sister to try. She called one night and began with light conversation, inquiring about my children. Then she spoke casually. You know, maybe you should just finish the house. They're being stubborn, but it's probably easier if you just get it done. I laughed. So I do free labor and in return, they insult my kids, and you think I'm the one who should back down? She paused. I mean, it's their house, John. They're just stuck in their ways. You know how they are. I do. That's why I'm not doing it. She exhaled. Look, I get it, okay? But they're never going to admit they were wrong. They're our parents. That struck me. She knew they were mistaken. She wasn't even attempting to dispute it, but she knew they'd never say it aloud. I told her I had to leave and hung up. That night, I considered everything. About how for years, I had done things for them without expecting anything in return. About how they had never showed me genuine appreciation. They acted as if it was my responsibility to help them but an inconvenience to help me. And I determined I was finished, completely. That was the night I blocked their numbers. 2 days later, my sister arrived at my place unexpectedly. I opened the door and noticed her standing there, looking embarrassed. We need to talk, she said. I allowed her inside. She sat down at my kitchen table and stared at me for a moment. Then she sighed. They called the contractor, she explained. It astonished me. Good, so they finally got someone to do it? She grimaced. Yeah, but there's a problem. I waited. They got scammed. I blinked. She nodded. Dad hired some guy off Facebook because he was cheaper than a real company. Paid him up front and now he's gone. Took the money and disappeared. I couldn't help it. I laughed. My sister shot me a glance. John, they lost $10,000. I stopped laughing. 10 grand? Wait, where did they even get that much money? They borrowed some of it, she told me. From family. That part took me off guard. Who? I asked. She hesitated before saying. Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda, even Grandma. I sat back. They borrowed from other individuals to avoid acknowledging they needed me, and now they were $10,000 in debt with a half-finished house. I shake my head. That's not my problem. My sister nodded slowly. I know, and I told them that. That made me pause. You what? She exhaled. I told them they should have just apologized to you. That they did this to themselves. For the first time in this disaster, I felt a shift. My sister, their favorite and golden kid, had actually spoken up for me. She leaned forwards. John, they're desperate. They want you to come back. They're still being stubborn, but they know they messed up. I crossed my arms. She shrugged. And I think you should make them beg. Hearing my sister say that threw me off. She had always been their favorite, the one they admired and supported. And now she told me to make them beg? I raised an eyebrow. You really think they'll do that? She flashed me a half smile. They don't have a choice? For the first time in my life, I felt in control. I slumped back in my chair. So what exactly do they want from me? She exhaled. They want you to come over and talk. I laughed. Yeah, I've heard that before. She nodded. I know, but this time they're not in control. You are. And she was correct. I did not go that day. I did not go the following day either. I let them sit in their messes. Allow them to sweat. A few days later, my mother broke. She wrote a rambling text that was part apology and part excuse. She admitted that they may have been unjust and should not have said what they did. But what is the funniest part? We should have handled things differently, but you also overreacted. I genuinely laughed when reading it. Even when they were desperate, they had to assign some blame. I ignored the message. Then my father tried. His response was simpler. John, we need you. Come back and finish the house. We'll figure everything else out later. No apologies, just say, we need you. I also overlooked that. The next night, my sister called. Okay, she said. I think they're actually breaking this time. What happened? They told me to tell you they're sorry. I blinked. Wait, they actually said that? She paused. Well, they told me to tell you, not in those exact words, but... I exhaled. Close enough. She then said something that astonished me. They asked if I thought you'd ever speak to them again. That made me pause. For the first time, I realized they were truly terrified. They were concerned not only about the house, but also that they had pushed me too far. Honestly, they had. I agreed to meet with them, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to hear from them. I told my sister I'd come over on my own terms. When I walked into their apartment, they seemed less confident and more apprehensive. My mother had been crying. My father looked fatigued. I sat, crossed my arms, and waited. Finally, my father sighed. We messed up, John. That was as close to an apology as I was going to receive. He went on to say how they didn't plan to hurt me, but were frustrated, exhausted, and stressed. That the home had gotten overbearing, and that they had spoken inappropriately. Then my mother finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. We love you and the kids. And, for the first time, I believed her. I waited for them to be silent for a bit before saying, I'm not finishing your house. My mother gasped, like if I'd slapped her. My father tensed. John, he answered. I cut him off. You had 2 months of free labor from me. You had help whenever you needed it, and the one thing I asked for in return was too much for you. Now I'm done. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not fixing your house. Silence. My mother seemed to want to quarrel, but she didn't. My father stared at the table. My sister was just watching. Then I stood up. But I'm willing to move forward if you stop treating me like I owe you something, if you stop treating my kids like they're less than my sisters, and if you understand that from now on, if I help you, it's because I want to, not because you expect it. They nodded because they had no other option. I left that day feeling I'd won. And for the first time in a long while, I felt liberated. Things did not suddenly improve following the meeting. My parents were not suddenly better people, and I wasn't foolish enough to believe they wouldn't try to push the boundaries again. But something had changed. They realized I wasn't going to be their handyman, backup plan, or safety net. They were afraid because they knew I was about to walk away. For a few weeks, there were no needless phone calls or guilt trips, only silence. It was nearly calm. Then, one afternoon, I received a text from my mother. Can we take the kids this weekend? We miss them. I stared at the text for a moment. This was the same woman who had referred to them as a burden and had made comparisons to my sister's children in their presence. Has she suddenly missed them? I tried to dismiss it, but I remembered my children. So I asked her, "Do you want to go?" They paused. My youngest, Ben, appeared hesitant. My oldest, Emily, crossed her arms. "Are they going to be weird again?" I was honest. "Maybe." They thought about it. Then Emily shrugged. "I guess we can go." So I quickly said, "Sure, I'll drop her off at 5. My parents were not the same that weekend when I dropped her off. My mother seemed extremely kind, as if she was trying too hard to show she wasn't the bad guy. My father was silent. I stayed for a few minutes, just enough to ensure my children's comfort. Then, before I left, my father pulled me aside. "We really love them, John," he remarked. "We just messed up." It wasn't a full apology, but for my father, it was as close as I could get. I just nodded. "Good. Then don't mess up again." Later that night, I received a call from my sister. "I have to tell you something," she said. Her voice conveyed seriousness. "What is it?" she exhaled. "Mom told me something the other day about why she stopped babysitting." I sat upright. "Because they were tired, right?" She paused. "No, that wasn't it. At least not the whole reason." I frowned. "What was it?" She took a deep breath. "You were jealous, John." I blinked. "Jealous of what?" She paused. "Of you. Of how much the family stood by you at Thanksgiving. Of how close you are with your children. About how you became the center of attention when they're used to it being me. That really threw me. That doesn't even make sense." "It does to them," she explained. "You felt like you lost control, like people were looking at you as the good son, the responsible one, and that pissed them off." I sat there, trying to digest everything. My parents were more than just tired of babysitting, they were bitter. I'm bitter because I was a nice father. It was wild. It was sad. And that just reinforced one thing for me: they would never really change. I did not inform my parents what my sister said. It wouldn't have altered anything, but I did modify how I handled them from that point forward. Everything was on my terms. When they wanted to see the children, only if my kids wanted to. If they needed my assistance with something, they had to ask, not assume. If they ever disrespected my children again, that was it, no more chances. And the best part? They knew. For the first time in my life, I was not simply their son. I was someone they needed to respect. And that was worth everything. For a while, everything remained polite. My folks were on their best behavior. They didn't push, guilt me, or ask me for help around the house anymore. It was almost as if they had finally understood. Until they hadn't. My aunt contacted me one Sunday afternoon and asked, "John, did you see what your mom posted on Facebook?" It was never a pleasant sentence to hear. When I opened the app, there was a lengthy, dramatic post from my mother about how family members should always help one another and how some people forget where they came from. After everything we've done, it's heartbreaking to see our own son turn his back on us. She did not mention my name, but everyone understood who she was talking about. And the best part? She concluded, "At least we still have our amazing daughter, who never left us." That was it. That was it. I was done. I didn't text or phone her. I wrote a simple response to the post. "You're right, Mom. Family should help each other. That's why I spent 2 months fixing your house for free while you sat in your apartment. That's why I asked for nothing in return except that you treat my kids with basic respect. And when you called them a burden and compared them to my sister's children, I realized that you don't want a family. You want servants. And I'm not playing that role anymore." I pressed submit and saw the torrents open. The first comment came from my uncle. "Wow, I didn't know the whole story. This is messed up." Then my aunt. "John is right. You took advantage of him. He gave you everything and you repaid him by insulting his children. Unbelievable." Then my grandmother, the one from whom they borrowed money. "You told me you needed the money because John refused to help you, but you never told me why. Now I see the truth." Comment after comment sided with me, and the best one came from my sister. "I love Mom and Dad, but John is telling the truth. They treated him unfairly, and he has every right to leave." My golden sister, the one they always favored and supported, didn't defend them. I sat back and watched my parents' reputations crumble in real time. About an hour later, the post was deleted. My mother tried to call, but I didn't answer. She then texted, "Was that necessary?" I responded, "Was your mail necessary?" There was nothing. A few days later, my father caved in. He simply wrote, "We were wrong. We're sorry." No excuses. No blame. And, frankly, I didn't need anything else. I never worked on their home again. They had to hire someone at full price. I would never let them shame me into anything again. If they wanted to see my kids, it was because they wanted to, not because they forced it. And what's the biggest change? They never compared my children to my sister's children again because they knew if they did, it would be their final time seeing her. I had placed them in their place, and for the first time, they realized it. I'd won. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.